Good evening. This is Coach Norman doing a quick impromptu recording due to my jury duty I have tomorrow. So this is not going to be a key questions video. You can look at that at a different time as I'll be loading that up later. But for now, let's just talk about chapter 16. As you can tell, the main theme of this chapter is King Cotton and plantation slavery and how cotton came to dominate everything in the United States, both North and South. And then it's also a discussion of how both sides began arguing and debating on both sides of it. So first, we have a map of the South, and you see the growth of cotton from 1820 to 1860. You see the commitment made by the South on that product. And so with the growth of northern industry, both of them helped the South commit to plantation economy and cotton. So this is a picture of slaves working on the fields, having collected all their cotton. And the next couple pictures are just kind of a depiction of what effect cotton had and what it looked like in the South. And this brings us to our first slide of information. So King Cotton and planter aristocracy, the South came to completely rely on cotton. And in order to completely capture all of that cotton, they also relied upon slavery. Now, what's interesting is the majority of families did not own slaves. In fact, if you look down at the stats, only 25% of families own slaves. We kind of picture the South as everyone owning it, but truthfully, there's a massive gap between the rich and the poor. This reliance by the entire economy, however, on slavery meant that it was quite dangerous economically speaking. If the world market shifted, or if there were diseases wiping out your labor, or if there was a drought, then the entire national economy, especially the southern economy, would suffer. The North grows due to King Cotton, however, so don't think that the North was innocent in the growth of slavery and in the demand for it. Moving on with that, this is a chart showing you exactly how many families own slaves. As you can see, only 1,733 owned 100 slaves or more, as we see often depicted in movies and television. The majority of families, again, this is only 25% that own slaves, and so this just shows you the breakdown of how many families owned how many. The white majority, most slave owners had fewer than 10 slaves, as that chart shown you, but again, 75% did not own slaves. So interestingly, why did poor whites defend slavery? Racial pride, the idea that despite them being toward the bottom of society and poor and struggling, they were still better than someone else, and that made them feel good. The economic logic of it as well stood out. They knew that how their region made money, and they knew that it just made sense. And since their area had already committed to slavery, they just understood that it was, reasonable to continue it. And then finally, they also had the idea that maybe one day I can join the elite. Maybe one day my family can own 100 plus slaves, and I can be a part of that plantation class. The Mountain Whites, however, supported the Union. So what we'll see when the Civil War breaks out, West Virginia breaks away from Virginia, one of the leading states of the Confederacy. And the reason is that the Mountain Whites had no ties to slavery. There was no cotton economy in Western Virginia, and that's why they ended up breaking away and actually joining the Union, and Lincoln will start a new state. So poor whites defended slavery, but some Mountain Whites, also poor whites, didn't support it. And again, it's about economic necessity. What about free blacks? Slaves without masters. In the South, blacks numbered around 250,000 by 1860. Some had been able to purchase their freedom a long time ago, while others were a mixed class. This third race were looked down upon, unfortunately, by both sides. They were banned from certain occupations, so even if they were free, they couldn't have certain jobs. They were vulnerable to being hijacked into slavery, which we'll get to in just a minute. In the North, blacks who went there, it was still not, they weren't treated equally. And that's something we definitely see as a theme in the early 1900s, but most people seem to think that the North loved blacks and wanted their freedom and wanted to treat them equally. The truth is that some states didn't want them there. They often had limited suffrage and no schooling. And even more, just like immigrants coming in that were disliked because of their job competition, so in the North, they also resisted blacks treating them well because they were job competition. The Irish, who were already hated upon by other white groups, hated blacks moving to the North because they competed for jobs. So what I like how the textbook puts it, they said that the North professed to like the race of black people, but they disliked the individual blacks because individually they were competing with them. As far as plantation slavery, 1860, 4 million black slaves were living in the South, despite in 1808 they actually banned the importation of slaves. And so the importation of slaves had disappeared. What had happened is, as the slave population grew and the demand further west grew, there developed an internal slave trade. And that just basically means that the slave trade shifted from the Atlantic Ocean and it shifted to inside of America from the East Coast and places like Virginia and Maryland, which didn't have a demand for cotton because they were still mostly tobacco economies. They would have their slaves reproduce and sell them further west. Of course, this leads to terrible things like breeding and having men and women come together in an area that professed that they were really Christian and moral and upright. To have a man and woman slave sleep together just to create a new and basically a new product to sell out west was quite terrible. Mulattoes stay slaves, and that's something that is noteworthy because even though white men often slept with black women, their slave women, often they did not allow their children to have freedom. So slaves were cared for as an asset and investment, sometimes spared dangerous work, often spared cruelty. We often make things seem a lot worse than they probably actually were on most plantations. Remember, they cost a lot of money to purchase, and while it sounds awful to talk about a human being that way, the truth of it is that many plantation slave owners knew their value, and so wouldn't likely want to maim them or cripple them so as to stop them from being productive or be worthy of being sold somewhere else. Finally, slave auctions become famous focus of the abolitionist anger and the inspiration of a book known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. And we'll talk more about Uncle Tom's Cabin in a future chapter, but just know that the main focus was families being separated and sold into other areas. Here is just a general advisement to be sold and let by public auction. The idea of slaves being sold again and being treated like they're animals. Notice also for sale, fine rice, graham patty, books. So comparing them to products just like those items just shows you really how they felt about them. Here's an example, that device at the top with the bells on it they put around a slave's neck in case he tried to run away. Here you see an overseer and dogs and slaves. Again, you can see the woman in the picture with just a little bit of that device around her neck to slow her down and to allow them to catch her or get caught on some brush. This brings us to one interesting character, Solomon Northup. I talked earlier about how free blacks were often targeted and could be dragged into slavery. And his book, 12 Years a Slave, is written after he is captured and kidnapped, and he's taken to the South. He was a free man, an intelligent, educated free man who could even play the music for crowds. But he is drugged and dragged to the South and sold into slavery. And after 12 years, as the book says, he finally makes it back north to his family, torn up, a depressed man, of course, at that time. But it did give sensational details in his book and also recently became a film. Life under the lash, conditions varied greatly. And that's one thing that really stands out when you read a lot about slave and plantation culture, is that slaves were treated differently based upon the plantation they were on. Now, to be fair, none of them had political rights. The protection laws, some states try to protect them, but that didn't mean anything if they wanted to break you, if they wanted to make sure that you gave in. Then you would often see them be flogged by what they called on their breakers. Beatings made stolen workers and damaged their resale value. Why not beat them? Well, then they don't want to work for you. Then they're depressed or they're angry, and they're going to intensely try to undermine the work being done. There's stories about them destroying machinery, of pilfering goods, of intentionally working slowly as across the plantation to punish the owner for being cruel to them. And so oftentimes slaves actually had some control and power over how they were treated based upon how they acted when they were mistreated. So what the Deep South is, you have 5 states, and I believe it's on the next slide. You can see in 1860, those 5 states of the Deep South, those with the heaviest population of slaves, are South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And those areas are the focus of the cotton economy. When you look at Louisiana and western Mississippi, you can see that the majority of the state is actually covered in that dark red, which means that they actually made up over 50% of the population there. Interestingly, if you look at the picture to the top, you can see that the slaves have migrated further west and cover a greater amount of territory. But you just see a lot of growth over 1860. So family life was mostly stable in the Deep South, allowed to develop distinct African American culture. We talked a little bit about that before. Responsorial preaching. We talked about the ring shout, dancing and singing. And now we have it kind of taking off during that Second Great Awakening time period as well. So the major slave revolts to cover, and we'll cover this briefly in the video, but we've talked about the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. In 1741, there's another conspiracy. They blame slaves for the burning of part of the city, and so slaves are kind of the scapegoat for the tragedy of the city catching fire. In 1800, we have a near massive rebellion. Just as Thomas Jefferson is taking office, Gabriel Prosser planned an attack on Richmond, Virginia. He had been a blacksmith who worked for several plantations. His skills had made him valuable, and so he traveled around working, and that enabled him to talk to lots of different groups and gather a lot of people to his plot. Unfortunately for Prosser, or Gabriel, often that Prosser name was the name of his owner, so you'll often see it as just Gabriel's conspiracy. But Gabriel, there's a massive storm on the day in which he planned to lead that rebellion, and so it never actually happens, and so he is caught and executed along with a lot of his fellow conspirators. In 1831, the largest and deadliest of these slave rebellions, Nat Turner, he considered himself a prophet. He preached to them, and he led slaves to slaughter slave owners before a militia was able to step in. Why did he do it? Well, he was frustrated with being kept captive, and when you read his testimony, he clearly, truly believed that he was being led, that he'd seen prophecies, and that he had been told that he would lead a successful rebellion. But what I want you to notice from both of these is that Gabriel's rebellion, you see owners could not share slaves after that. Men like Gabriel who were skilled could not travel from plantation to plantation. Instead, you would stay on your one plantation and not be allowed to contact other plantations. In Nat Turner's rebellion, you see, due to his religious leadership, states passed laws where black slaves would not be allowed to worship without whites present. So once again, the theme to slave rebellions is that oftentimes their rights are restricted, even though they hardly have any rights. You see their ability to travel from plantation to plantation, and even worship on their own time in their own way without whites present are taken away. Early abolitionism. So early abolitionism formed right after the Revolution. I mentioned this before. Pennsylvania Quakers are the first to try to stop slavery from continuing and spreading. So in 1817, they form a group called the American Colonization Society. Now, interestingly, during Monroe's presidency, this Colonization Society figured that the best way to solve the crisis growing between blacks and whites was to send free blacks back to Africa. They created a nation called Liberia, with its capital at Monrovia, which was named after the president, and over 15,000 blacks will be sent there over 4 decades. Ironically, most Africans living in America had no wish to return to Africa. Most of them had no real connection to Africa, and considered the United States, although it had mistreated them, they considered their history and culture American and not African. Also, you have a man named Theodore Dwight Weld. He was inspired by the Second Great Awakening. He was actually expelled for organizing a slavery debate at Lane Seminary. After that, he begins printing propaganda, and he influences the author Harriet Beecher Stowe, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there's just some influential people in the early stages of abolition. There's another leader of the Second Great Awakening and the social reform movement of abolitionism that followed. So what about some radical abolitionists? And these are names that stand out because they weren't just run-of-the-mill, let's try to get rid of it or slowly, gradually get rid of it. And we lead off with William Lloyd Garrison. He creates a newspaper called The Liberator. He demanded immediate, uncompensated end to slavery. In other words, it ends now because they deserve their freedom. They're human beings. And one of the issues is that people of the South didn't want to have to give up such a valuable asset that they owned for nothing, and that these men would suddenly be free. And how would they continue to keep the cotton economy going if they lost all that money and their labor source? Garrison didn't care, however. He believed that it was just so inhumane and evil that they should be freed immediately, which is, ironically, exactly what ends up happening. He founds the American Anti-Slavery Society as well. The problem is his confrontational approach didn't really gain much support because he was so radical and in people's face. David Walker was an African American who wrote a book, or I think it's more of a pamphlet, called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. Why is David Walker remembered so much? Because he also, being a radical man, pushed for a bloody end to slavery, basically whatever it takes to end it by any means necessary. And so he was basically encouraging slaves on plantations to rise up, fight, and kill if they had to for their freedom. This brings us to another figure, Sojourner Truth. She is a former slave as well. She fought for emancipation after she gets her freedom and women's rights. And her most famous speech, which we may look at a future date in class, "Ain't I a woman?" is her retort to a man questioning her giving a speech. And then poor Elijah Lovejoy, we'll skip ahead really quickly. That's him on the bottom. In the middle there, he kind of looks like the bad guy from The Incredibles, if I'm being honest. But he had a newspaper. He had it burned down several times. It was an abolitionist newspaper. And then finally, after, I believe it's the 7th time he had rebuilt his printing press. Don't quote me on that number. But eventually he is murdered, and he is considered one of the first martyrs of the abolitionist movement. This brings us to another familiar face. Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a more moderate abolitionist. That is, he was willing to work with other sides to bring about a compromise to it. He was a former slave who had escaped in 1838. When he's seen giving a speech by abolitionists, he becomes one of the people on the forefront of it. And he truly is a leader throughout the rest of our time fighting against slavery in abolition. So how does he compare to to William Lloyd Garrison? Well, Garrison was stubborn. He demanded the North should even secede from the South in order to get rid of slavery. And he pointed out problems, but he didn't really offer any solutions. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass was a flexible, practical man who used politics and negotiation and compromise to eventually accomplish his goals. He also is a part of the Liberty Party, then the Free Soil Party, and the Republican Party, a new party which forms just at the outbreak of the Civil War. All those parties, don't worry if you're freaking out, I haven't heard of those. We'll cover those at a future date in the next couple chapters. The South lashes back. So you have Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, and when you combine that with the nullification crisis, the South begins to really fear that changes are going to be forced upon them. So think about the federal government cracking down on the nullification of the tariff. Makes them wonder, maybe eventually the North will try to crack down on their practice of slavery. So the South moved to silence the anti-slavery societies. In 1831-1832, Virginia debates emancipation but rejects it. Instead, Virginia bans emancipation of any kind. Remember, I'd mentioned that previously you could actually purchase your freedom as a slave if you were able to work on the side. Now they just get rid of it completely. Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, he is declared an insider and a terrorist in that time period. And Georgia actually offers up $5,000 if someone could drag him down to the South, arrest him, and eventually lead to his conviction. And probably the worst part of it all, there are many people who are jailed, there are many people who are whipped, and worst of all, there are many who are lynched as their rational efforts to discuss slavery end in their deaths. So anyone who stood up against slavery in the South was often met with resistance and sometimes violent resistance. So what arguments does the South make to defend the practice of slavery? Pro-slavery whites defended slavery. John C. Calhoun himself called it a positive good for both groups. The whites and the plantation owners and the farmers benefited from their labor, but the blacks also benefited because we saved them from Africa in Calhoun's mind. We Christianized them. We gave them a home. We give them clothing and food. So he argues that it is a positive good for both whites and blacks. Edmund Ruffin, on the other hand, argues that the wage slaves of the North were much worse off than Southern slaves. We talked before about just how bad life was in Northern manufacturing, the terrible working conditions, the long working hours, and of course the pitiful wages. So in his mind, it's the people of the North who are suffering more than the slaves of the South. Southern congressmen also passed the gag resolution. This said that no anti-slavery petitions could be read to Congress. So if you tried to send a letter to your congressman, they could not read your petition, which is actually a constitutional right. And then as abolitionists used the mail to spread their word, Congress actually orders postmasters to destroy all abolitionist materials. So you can see the South using their power in Congress with their large numbers to get rid of any dissent and argument against the practice of slavery. This is John C. Calhoun. He's a little creepy, and I'd also like to point out that he looks a lot like Sam the Eagle, that classic Muppet. Ignore this slide. I was having fun. So finally, this is a map of areas that got rid of slavery. You can see in the Northwest, we talked about how in the Northwest Land Ordinance, slavery was prohibited from the very beginning. in those territories. In the Northeast, you see Pennsylvania passes laws that had a gradual emancipation. Meanwhile, when Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts are formed, they all, in their state constitution, decided to get rid of slavery. Finally, what is the abolitionist impact in the North? Abolitionists were unpopular in the North. They revered the Constitution, saw slave clauses as a lasting bargain. In other words, we made a deal, so trying to get rid of slavery is just creating more contention and fighting than it's worth. Part of that is because the North also had a heavy stake in the Southern economy. If the Southern economy fails, what happens to the Northern economy? Their banks are owed $300 million. They fear the disruption of manufacturing because their factories did not have anything to make if they weren't getting slavery, or excuse me, if they weren't getting cotton from slave plantations. So despite some violent attacks, abolitionists turned Northern opinion by the 1850s. We'll talk more about the events that slowly changed their opinion, specifically Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Fugitive Slave Act, which is part of the Compromise of 1850. Not many wanted outright abolition, however, but a growing number did not want it extended westward. So it's a debate over free soil and also what we're going to do with all this new territory once again that sparks that lasting debate. Anyway, so you're probably sitting in class right now and you're like, why did you teach for 21 minutes? But I figure you'd rather me teach for 21 minutes or 21 and a half, probably 22 by the time I'm done talking to you. You're probably thinking that this is a little too long, but again, this is better than me droning on for 45 minutes or being a goofball the entire time. So use the rest of your class period to look over your key questions. I talked about some main information, and hopefully this will give you enough that you can look through and answer those questions over the next 20 or so minutes that you should have left. Hope you'll have a great day, and hopefully I will return as soon as possible from this jury duty. Click like and subscribe. Is that what they say? I think so. Good night.